"You're irrelevant," the judge said, and in that moment the entire courtroom believed it, because the man standing there did not look like someone who mattered, his jacket slightly worn, his posture quiet, his presence easy to overlook, the kind of person people pass in hallways without ever remembering his face. And yet there was something in his eyes that did not match the way he was being dismissed, something steady, something patient, as if he had already seen how this moment would unfold. The judge leaned back slightly in his chair, confident, composed, a man used to being the final word in any room he entered. His voice had not been loud, but it had carried weight, the kind of weight that shuts people down before they even try to speak. Attorneys at both tables remained still. No one rushed to defend the man. No one objected, because the system had already decided who mattered and who did not. And this man had been placed firmly in the second category. The prosecutor adjusted a stack of files, her attention already moving forward as if the interruption had been resolved. The defense attorney hesitated for a brief second, glancing toward the man as if considering whether anything of value could come from him. But even that hesitation faded quickly under the authority of the bench. The room moved on without him, or at least it tried to, because while everyone else returned to their roles, the man did not move. He did not argue. He did not show frustration. He simply stood there, his hands resting loosely at his sides, his gaze fixed not on the judge but on the screen behind the attorneys, where a timeline of events was displayed in clean, precise rows, timestamps aligned neatly, every detail presented as fact, and yet something about it did not sit right, not to him, because 6 hours earlier, in a quiet hallway just outside the restricted area, he had noticed something small, something almost invisible, a flicker on a digital panel, a time that did not align with the sequence now being shown. It had caught his attention not because it was dramatic, but because it was wrong, and people like him noticed what was wrong because they spent their lives in the spaces others ignored, cleaning up after moments, observing without being seen. And now that detail stood in his mind with quiet clarity. He finally shifted his gaze toward the judge, not challenging, not defiant, just certain, and in a voice that did not rise above the room, but somehow cut through it anyway. He said, "Then why does your timeline not match your own court record?" And for the first time since the session began, the room did not move. It paused, not loudly, not visibly, but completely, as if something unseen had just entered and taken hold of every thought in the space. The judge's expression did not change immediately, but there was a brief stillness, a fraction of a second where his certainty hesitated, and that was all it took, because once doubt appears, it does not leave quietly, and the man who had just been dismissed did not speak again. He did not need to, because the question he asked was no longer his. It belonged to the entire courtroom now, and no one there yet understood how much that single moment was about to change everything. The silence did not break immediately after his question. It settled deeper, heavier, like something unseen had just shifted beneath the surface of the entire courtroom, and no one wanted to be the first to acknowledge it. Judge Carter remained still for a fraction longer than anyone expected, his hand resting lightly against the edge of the bench, his expression composed, but no longer absolute. His eyes moved toward the screen behind the attorneys where the timeline remained displayed in clean rows of data. Nothing had changed on the surface, and yet everything about it now felt uncertain. The prosecutor was the first to react, her posture straightening. As she stepped slightly forward, her voice measured but controlled. "Your Honor, the timeline presented is verified and has been submitted as part of the official record," she said. But even as she spoke, there was a subtle hesitation, as if the certainty she relied on had just been tested in a way she did not anticipate. The defense attorney turned his head slowly toward the screen, then back toward the man who had spoken, his eyes narrowing slightly, not in doubt, but in recognition, because what had just happened was not an argument, it was a fracture. Kevin Brooks stood exactly where he had been moments before, his posture unchanged, his gaze steady. He did not repeat himself, he did not elaborate, he simply waited, because he understood something the others were only beginning to realize, that once a question exposes a flaw, it does not require repetition, it requires examination. The clerk glanced toward the judge, waiting for instruction, her fingers hovering above the keyboard as if unsure whether to proceed or pause. Judge Carter leaned forward slightly, now his voice calm, but carrying a different tone than before. Clerk, display the source log associated with the timeline entry, he said, and this time the command was not dismissive, it was deliberate. The screen flickered briefly as the data shifted, revealing a secondary layer of information: timestamps tied to system entries, access points, recorded sequences that supported the original display. The prosecutor nodded faintly as if reassured by the additional data. The system logs confirm the sequence, Your Honor, she added. But the defense attorney did not move, his attention fixed on the screen, as if searching for something beyond what was being shown. Kevin's eyes followed the same section of the display, not scanning, not guessing, but recognizing. Because 6 hours earlier he had stood in a narrow hallway where the lighting was dim and the sound of footsteps echoed differently, he had paused for a moment near a digital panel mounted beside a restricted door, watching as a time indicator flickered briefly before resetting. It had been subtle, something most people would ignore, but he had noticed it because the reset did not align with the normal pattern he had seen every day. And now, as the data filled the screen, he saw it again, not as a memory, but as a mismatch. The judge's expression tightened almost imperceptibly as he followed the entries, his eyes slowing at one point, then moving back again as if something did not sit right. The defense attorney finally stepped forward, his voice calm but precise. Your Honor, may I request that the exact time source be expanded and cross-referenced with the access panel records, he said, and for the first time since the session began, the direction of the room shifted away from assumption and toward verification. The prosecutor turned slightly, her composure intact, but her focus sharpened. Judge Carter did not respond immediately, his gaze still fixed on the data, as the silence returned, not empty this time, but charged. And in that silence, one thing became clear to everyone: present the man who had been dismissed had not interrupted the case. He had redirected it. And whatever was about to be revealed next was no longer under anyone's control. The request did not linger in uncertainty for long, because once the direction of a courtroom shifts toward verification, it cannot easily return to assumption. The clerk responded immediately, her fingers moving across the keyboard as the display expanded again. Lines of data unfolding into deeper layers, revealing system sources, panel logs, and recorded access sequences, each detail precise, structured, and until this moment unquestioned. Judge Carter leaned slightly forward, his attention fully engaged, now his earlier dismissal replaced by something more measured, more deliberate. The prosecutor remained composed, but her focus had narrowed, her confidence no longer projected outward, but directed inward toward the data itself. The defense attorney stepped closer to the screen, his eyes tracking the entries carefully, not scanning randomly, but following a pattern, as if aligning two separate narratives that were beginning to conflict. Kevin Brooks did not move from where he stood, his posture unchanged, his presence quiet, yet anchored, as if everything now unfolding had already passed through his understanding hours before. The screen continued to populate until a specific segment of the timeline came into focus, a sequence tied directly to the restricted hallway. The clerk paused briefly before isolating the entries as requested. Timestamps appeared in a tight cluster, each one linked to system authentication and access confirmation. The prosecutor spoke again, her voice steady though more deliberate. These entries confirm continuous system integrity. There are no interruptions in the record, she said. But the defense attorney did not respond immediately, his gaze fixed on a single point within the sequence. Judge Carter followed the same line, his expression tightening slightly as his eyes slowed over a narrow gap that was not entirely visible at first glance, but became clearer the longer it was observed. It was not a missing entry, it was something else, a repetition. Two identical timestamps recorded within a fraction of a second, subtle enough to be dismissed as system noise but precise enough to raise a question. The defense attorney finally spoke, his voice calm but focused. Your Honor, there appears to be a duplicated time entry within the same authentication cycle, he said. The prosecutor turned toward the screen, her posture still controlled, but her attention sharpened as she examined the same point. Kevin's eyes remained steady because he recognized it instantly, not as an anomaly, but as the exact moment he had seen the panel flicker, the reset he had noticed in the hallway now mirrored in the data before them. Judge Carter did not speak immediately, his gaze moving between the duplicated entries and the surrounding sequence, as if reconstructing the timeline in real time. The courtroom remained silent, not because nothing was happening, but because everything was happening at once beneath the surface. The clerk adjusted the display, expanding the microsecond interval between the entries, revealing the overlap more clearly. The prosecutor's expression shifted almost imperceptibly as the clarity increased, her earlier certainty now meeting something it could not easily explain. The defense attorney took a small step back, allowing the evidence to stand without further framing, because it no longer needed interpretation, it needed acknowledgement. Kevin remained still, his presence unchanged, because he had not introduced something new, he had revealed something that had already existed within the system. And as Judge Carter finally leaned back slightly, his expression no longer defined by authority, but by recognition, one truth settled into the room. With quiet certainty, the timeline had not simply been presented incorrectly, it had been accepted too quickly. And now that acceptance was being undone piece by piece in a silence that no one in that courtroom could control, the duplicated timestamp did not disappear. When the screen refreshed, it remained there, precise and undeniable, a small detail that refused to be dismissed the way everything else had been. Judge Carter leaned forward again, his fingers lightly pressing against the bench as his gaze fixed on the overlapping entries. This time he did not speak immediately, because what he was seeing required more than reaction, it required acknowledgement. The prosecutor stepped closer to the display, her composure still intact, but her confidence now measured. It could be a system synchronization artifact, she said carefully, choosing each word as if testing its strength before allowing it into the room. But the defense attorney did not respond right away. He simply looked at the sequence again, then slightly to the left where the access panel logs were aligned with the timeline. If it were synchronization, there would be a corresponding delay or offset in the subsequent entries, he said calmly, his voice not challenging but clarifying. The clerk adjusted the display once more, expanding the entries beyond the duplicated moment, revealing the continuation of the sequence. And there it was, no delay, no offset, no system correction. The data moved forward as if nothing had happened, except something had. Because the duplication was not a delay, it was an overlap. Kevin Brooks remained still, his eyes fixed on that exact point, not because it surprised him, but because it confirmed what he had already seen hours earlier in the hallway when the panel flickered and reset, without following the normal pattern. Judge Carter's expression shifted again, this time more visible, not dramatic, but unmistakable. The certainty that once defined his presence now replaced by careful scrutiny. Clerk cross-referenced the duplicated entry with physical access panel activity, he said, his voice steady but different now. The command carried weight, but not dismissal. The clerk nodded and began processing the request. The courtroom remained silent, the kind of silence that does not come from absence of sound, but from concentration. Every person in the room, now watching the same screen, no longer divided by roles, but unified by uncertainty. The data began to populate again, a secondary column appearing beside the timeline, showing panel interactions tied to physical presence. The prosecutor's posture tightened slightly as she followed the entries. The defense attorney stepped back just enough to allow the information to stand on its own, and Kevin did not move at all, because he understood something no one else had fully grasped yet. That this was not about proving he was right, it was about allowing the system to reveal where it had been wrong. The entries aligned one by one until they reached the duplicated moment, and then the difference appeared, not large, not obvious, but clear enough to change everything. Two separate panel interactions registered under the same timestamp. Not one repeated signal, but two distinct accesses recorded as if they had occurred at the exact same time. The prosecutor inhaled slightly, her composure holding but no longer absolute. The defense attorney's eyes narrowed, not in surprise, but in confirmation. Judge Carter leaned back slowly, his gaze still locked on the screen, as if recalculating every assumption that had brought them to this point. And in that quiet recalculation, one truth settled over the room with undeniable clarity. The timeline had not simply been flawed, it had concealed something. And now that concealment was no longer hidden, it was visible, measurable, and impossible to ignore. The moment the dual panel interactions appeared under a single timestamp, the room did not react with noise, it reacted with stillness, the kind that settles when something expected to be simple reveals a layer no one had prepared for. Judge Carter remained silent for a second longer than before, his eyes fixed on the data, as if waiting for it to correct itself, but it did not. It remained precise, structured, and unchanged. The prosecutor stepped forward again, her voice controlled, but now carrying the weight of adjustment. Your Honor, simultaneous panel interactions could indicate overlapping authorization signals from the same credential, she said, offering explanation without fully committing to certainty. The defense attorney turned slightly toward her, his tone calm, but deliberate. That would require a mirrored signal path or a system echo, and there is no corresponding echo in the log sequence. He replied, not raising his voice, not pressing, simply aligning what was visible with what was missing. The clerk continued to expand the dataset, bringing in a third column, this time internal system identifiers attached to each access event. And with that addition, the pattern sharpened further. Each panel interaction carried a distinct identifier, not duplicated, not echoed, but separate. The prosecutor's posture tightened slightly as she reviewed the identifiers, her earlier explanation no longer fitting cleanly within the data. Kevin Brooks did not move his gaze steady on the same entries because he understood what they meant even before they were fully interpreted. Two interactions at the same moment meant two presences, not one. And the system had recorded both without error. Judge Carter finally spoke, his voice low but precise. Clerk, isolate the identifiers and map them to credential holders, he said, the instruction carrying a different weight, now not dismissive, not reactive, but investigative. The courtroom remained silent as the clerk processed the request, the screen shifting again as names and access levels began to populate beside each identifier. One entry aligned with the expected credential, the one already presented in the case. But the second entry paused before resolving, as if the system itself required a moment longer to reveal what had always been there. The prosecutor's eyes followed the line, her expression controlled, but no longer composed with certainty. The defense attorney did not move, his attention fixed on that single unresolved identifier. Kevin's posture remained unchanged, but his breathing slowed slightly, as if recognizing that the moment he had anticipated was arriving without resistance. The identifier finally resolved, not as an error, not as an unknown, but as a registered executive-level credential. The room did not react immediately, because the implication required a second to fully register. Judge Carter's gaze shifted slowly from the screen to the attorneys, and then briefly toward Kevin before returning to the data. The prosecutor did not speak this time, her silence more telling than any explanation. The defense attorney allowed the moment to settle without interruption because it no longer required argument, and Kevin Brooks remained exactly where he had been, quiet, steady, and certain, because the question he had asked had now revealed something no one could dismiss. That the timeline had not only been incomplete, it had excluded a presence that changed everything. And once that presence became visible, the case itself could no longer stand in the shape it had been built upon. The presence of a second credential did not create noise in the courtroom, it created gravity, the kind that pulls every assumption downward until it settles into something real. Judge Carter remained seated, his posture unchanged, but his authority now expressed through attention rather than control. His eyes moved slowly across the screen, tracing the alignment between identifiers, timestamps, and panel interactions, as if reconstructing the case from the beginning without relying on what had already been stated. The prosecutor stood still, her composure intact, but restrained, her earlier certainty now replaced by careful observation as she reviewed the newly revealed credential. The defense attorney did not speak immediately, his silence intentional, allowing the data to exist without interpretation because it no longer required framing. Kevin Brooks remained where he had been, his posture steady, his presence quiet yet central to everything unfolding. He did not look toward the judge or the attorneys, he kept his gaze on the screen, because that was where the truth had always been. Judge Carter finally spoke, his voice measured and deliberate. Clerk, display the access level and authorization scope for the secondary credential, he said, the instruction clear and direct. The clerk responded quickly, expanding the identifier into a full profile, revealing clearance level, entry permissions, and authorized zones within the building. The courtroom remained silent as the details appeared. Not because they were complicated, but because they were precise. The secondary credential carried executive-level access, unrestricted, within the same corridor where the incident had been placed. The prosecutor's posture shifted slightly as she processed the implications, her focus narrowing, as if recalibrating the case in real time. The defense attorney stepped forward just enough to acknowledge the development, his tone calm, but grounded. Your Honor, the existence of an additional authorized Presence directly contradicts the premise that the defendant was the only individual within that space during the recorded time, he said, not as an argument, but as a statement aligned with the data. Judge Carter nodded slightly, his gaze still fixed on the screen. Clerk cross-referenced the secondary credential with personnel records and active assignments at the time of entry, he said. The direction now fully investigative. The clerk began processing again, the system pulling from internal records, aligning the credential with a registered identity. Kevin's breathing remained slow, and even because he understood that this moment was no longer about what he had seen, it was about what the system could no longer hide. The screen updated once more, the name associated with the credential appearing beside the identifier. The courtroom did not react immediately the way it had earlier because the shift was no longer surprising, it was confirming. The prosecutor did not speak, her silence now an acknowledgement that the structure of the case had changed beyond adjustment. The defense attorney remained still, allowing the information to stand without interruption. Judge Carter leaned back slightly, his expression composed, but transformed, not uncertain, but recalibrated. The authority he carried now grounded in recognition rather than assumption. Kevin Brooks did not move. He did not need to, because the question he had asked had already done what it was meant to do. It had opened a path the courtroom could not ignore. And as the weight of that realization settled into every corner of the room, one truth became unavoidable. The case had not simply overlooked a detail, it had overlooked a presence. And once that presence became visible, everything built without it could no longer remain intact. The name attached to the secondary credential did not echo through the courtroom, it settled into it. Quiet but absolute. The kind of detail that does not need to be announced because its meaning is immediately understood by everyone present. Judge Carter's gaze remained fixed on the screen for a moment longer before shifting slowly toward the attorneys, his expression no longer defined by authority alone but by the responsibility to reassess everything that had been built upon an incomplete narrative. The prosecutor stood still, her posture composed, but restrained, her earlier confidence now replaced by a careful awareness that the case she had presented was no longer aligned with the evidence before them. The defense attorney remained calm, his presence steady, as if recognizing that the case had already begun to move beyond argument and into correction. Kevin Brooks did not move, his posture unchanged, his presence quiet but no longer overlooked. He had not stepped forward, he had not demanded attention, yet the room now revolved around what he had revealed. Judge Carter finally spoke, his voice measured and deliberate. Clerk, confirm whether the secondary credential was active within the same time frame as the primary entry associated with the defendant, he said, the instruction precise. The clerk responded immediately, her fingers moving across the keyboard as the system processed the request. The courtroom remained silent, every movement now focused on the screen as the confirmation began to take shape. The data aligned once more, the timestamps overlapping exactly, not within approximation, but with exact precision. The clerk nodded slightly before speaking. The secondary credential was active within the same time frame, Your Honor, she said, her voice clear. The statement did not create surprise, it confirmed what had already been understood. The prosecutor exhaled slowly, her composure holding but no longer carrying certainty. The defense attorney stepped forward just enough to speak, his tone calm but grounded. Your Honor, this confirms that the defendant was not the sole individual present within the restricted area at the time in question, he said. The words simple but definitive. Judge Carter nodded once, his gaze returning to the screen, as if ensuring that nothing within the data contradicted what had just been established. Kevin Brooks remained still, his eyes steady, because he knew this moment was no longer about what he had seen, it was about what could no longer be denied. The courtroom held its silence not out of hesitation, but out of recognition that the structure of the case had shifted entirely. The prosecutor did not respond immediately, her attention fixed on the data, as if searching for something that might restore the narrative, but finding nothing that could. Judge Carter leaned back slightly, his posture composed but transformed. The authority he carried now expressed through acknowledgement rather than control. And as that realization settled across the room, one truth became unavoidable. The case had not simply been weakened, it had been redefined. Because once it is proven that more than one presence existed within a moment that was built on singular blame, the entire foundation of that blame can no longer stand. And in that quiet understanding, the courtroom did not erupt, it recalibrated. shifting from certainty to truth in a way that no one could reverse. The confirmation did not end the tension, it refined it into something sharper, more focused. Because now the question was no longer whether the timeline was flawed, but what that flaw revealed about everything that had followed. Judge Carter remained seated, his posture composed, but his presence transformed, his authority no longer expressed through dismissal, but through careful control of what would come next. His eyes moved once more across the screen, not searching for contradiction, but ensuring that what had been established could withstand scrutiny. The prosecutor stepped forward again, her voice measured but quieter now. Your Honor, even with the presence of a second credential, there is no direct evidence linking that individual to the specific action under review, she said, her words precise, but no longer carrying the same certainty they once had. The defense attorney did not respond immediately. He allowed the statement to settle before speaking, his tone calm and grounded. The issue is no longer direct linkage. The issue is that the original claim depended on exclusivity of presence, and that exclusivity has now been disproven, he said, his words aligning cleanly with the data without needing emphasis. Kevin Brooks remained still, his gaze steady, not shifting between speakers, because he was not following the argument, he was following the truth as it continued to unfold in a direction that no one could redirect. Judge Carter leaned slightly forward, his voice low but deliberate. Clerk, display movement sequence for both credentials within the restricted corridor, he said, the instruction precise. The clerk complied immediately, the screen adjusting to reveal a visual representation of access progression, not just timestamps, but directional flow within the space. The courtroom remained silent as the sequence appeared, two paths moving within the same corridor, overlapping at key points, then diverging again. The prosecutor's posture tightened slightly as she observed the pattern, her earlier explanation now meeting a structure that did not support it. The defense attorney stepped back, allowing the visual to stand on its own because it required no interpretation. Kevin's eyes followed the sequence calmly because he recognized it not as new information, but as confirmation of what he had already understood when he saw the panel flicker and reset. Judge Carter's expression remained composed but focused, his attention moving along the paths, as if reconstructing the physical presence behind the data. There are two distinct movement patterns recorded within the same time frame, he said quietly, not as a question, but as a recognition. The prosecutor did not interrupt this time, her silence now more revealing than any argument. The defense attorney nodded slightly, his role no longer to persuade, but to ensure clarity remained. Kevin Brooks did not move because he did not need to. The system had begun to speak for itself, and as the visual sequence completed its display, one truth settled into the room with quiet certainty. The narrative that had once appeared complete was now visibly incomplete, not through assumption, but through its own recorded structure. And once that incompleteness becomes visible, it cannot be reversed, it can only be addressed. And in that moment, the courtroom did not erupt, it recalibrated again, shifting further away from what had been claimed and closer to what could no longer be denied. The visual sequence did not fade. When the screen dimmed slightly, it remained in the minds of everyone in the room. Two paths intersecting where only one had been claimed, and that intersection changed everything, not loudly, but completely. Judge Carter did not speak immediately, his gaze still fixed forward, as if allowing the full weight of what had been revealed to settle without interruption. The prosecutor stood motionless, her posture composed, but restrained, her earlier certainty now replaced by careful calculation. The defense attorney remained steady, his presence grounded, as if recognizing that the case had already crossed a point where argument no longer shaped the outcome. Kevin Brooks stood exactly where he had been from the beginning, his posture quiet, his expression unchanged, but no longer overlooked, because what he had done was not to challenge authority, it was to expose what authority had failed to see. Judge Carter finally shifted slightly, his voice calm, but deliberate. Clerk, isolate the moment of overlap and identify positional proximity between the two credentials, he said. The instruction precise. The clerk responded immediately, adjusting the display, once more the sequence narrowing to the exact point where both paths converged. The courtroom remained silent as the system mapped the positions within the corridor, showing not just movement but distance between the two presences. The prosecutor's eyes followed the data, her focus sharp but contained. The defense attorney stepped slightly closer, not to interrupt, but to observe as the information resolved. The screen displayed the overlap, clearly now both credentials within the same restricted zone at the same moment, not passing, not separated, but present. Judge Carter's expression tightened almost imperceptibly as he studied the proximity, his attention no longer divided but fixed. The prosecutor spoke carefully, her tone measured. "Proximity alone does not establish interaction," she said, her words controlled, but now carrying less weight than before. The defense attorney did not respond immediately. He allowed the statement to exist before speaking, his voice calm and precise. "It does establish that the narrative of isolated presence is no longer valid," he said, his words aligning with what the screen already showed. Kevin Brooks remained still, his eyes steady, because he understood that this was the moment where the case shifted from uncertainty to contradiction. Judge Carter leaned back slightly, his gaze moving once more across the display, as if confirming that nothing within the data could restore the original claim. The silence in the courtroom deepened, not from hesitation, but from recognition that what had been presented as fact could no longer stand without question. The prosecutor did not speak again, her attention fixed forward as if searching for a way to reconcile what could not be reconciled. The defense attorney remained composed, his role now simply to allow the truth to remain visible. Kevin did not move because he did not need to. The system had revealed what had been hidden, and now it belonged to the court. And as that realization settled fully into the room, one truth became undeniable: the case was no longer about proving what happened, it was about confronting what had been overlooked. And once something overlooked becomes visible, it cannot be ignored again. It changes everything that follows. The realization did not arrive as a shock, it settled as a quiet inevitability, the kind that does not need to be announced because everyone in the room could already feel it taking shape. Judge Carter remained still for a moment longer, his gaze no longer searching the data, but holding it, as if measuring what it now required of him. The courtroom had shifted beyond argument and into something more deliberate, something that demanded correction rather than defense. The prosecutor finally stepped forward, her voice controlled, but noticeably more careful. "Your Honor, the presence of a second individual does not necessarily invalidate the sequence of events attributed to the defendant. It only introduces an additional variable that must be evaluated," she said, her words precise, but no longer guiding the room. The defense attorney turned slightly toward her, his tone calm but firm. "It introduces a variable that was not disclosed while presenting a narrative built on singular responsibility, and that changes the foundation of the claim itself," he replied, his voice steady. Kevin Brooks remained still, his posture unchanged, his presence quiet, but now central in a way that could not be reversed. Judge Carter leaned forward slightly, his voice measured and deliberate. "Clerk, expand the overlap window and display activity immediately before and after the convergence," he said, the instruction clear. The clerk complied immediately, the screen adjusting once more, revealing the seconds leading into the overlap and the moments that followed. The courtroom remained silent as the sequence unfolded. Two paths approaching the same point, then diverging again, not randomly, but with direction. The prosecutor's eyes followed the movement, her focus narrowing, as if searching for alignment that could restore the narrative. The defense attorney remained still, allowing the data to speak without interruption. Kevin's gaze remained steady because he recognized the pattern not as a possibility, but as confirmation of what he had already understood. Judge Carter studied the sequence carefully, his attention fixed on the divergence points. "There is a directional separation immediately after the overlap," he said quietly, not as a conclusion, but as recognition. The prosecutor responded cautiously. "That separation does not establish which individual engaged in the action under review," she said, her tone controlled but no longer confident. The defense attorney did not respond immediately. He allowed the statement to settle before speaking, his voice calm and grounded. "It does establish that the assumption of exclusive presence cannot be sustained, and without that assumption the attribution becomes uncertain," he said. Kevin Brooks did not move. He did not need to, because the system had already moved the case beyond what words could argue. Judge Carter leaned back slowly, his gaze moving once more across the display, as if confirming that no part of the sequence contradicted what had now been established. The silence in the courtroom deepened, not from confusion, but from clarity. The prosecutor remained still, her attention fixed forward, as if acknowledging that the structure she had relied on could not hold under the weight of what had been revealed. the defense attorney remained composed, his role now complete in allowing the truth to remain visible. Kevin stood exactly as he had from the beginning, quiet, steady, and certain. And in that stillness, one truth became unavoidable. The case had not simply been challenged, it had been fundamentally altered. Because once uncertainty replaces assumption, the outcome can no longer follow the same path. It must be reconsidered entirely. And in that moment, the courtroom did not erupt, it shifted again quietly, but completely, into a space where truth no longer needed to be proven, it only needed to be acknowledged. The shift in the courtroom no longer felt temporary, it had settled into something permanent. The kind of change that does not reverse once it becomes visible. Judge Carter remained seated, his posture composed, but no longer anchored in the same certainty that had defined him at the beginning of the session. His gaze moved slowly across the room, not to assert control, but to measure the impact of what had unfolded. The prosecutor stood still, her presence steady, but restrained, her earlier confidence now replaced by a careful awareness that every word she chose would carry consequences beyond argument. The defense attorney remained calm, his role no longer to challenge, but to ensure that what had been revealed could not be overlooked again. Kevin Brooks stood quietly as he had from the start, his posture unchanged, yet his presence now undeniable. Not because he demanded attention, but because the truth he had introduced had taken hold of the entire proceeding. Judge Carter finally spoke, his voice measured and deliberate. The court has been presented with evidence that directly contradicts the foundational assumption of exclusive presence, he said, the words clear and steady. The prosecutor responded carefully, her tone controlled. Your Honor, the contradiction introduces uncertainty, but does not establish an alternative conclusion, she said, her voice no longer driving the narrative, but attempting to contain it. The defense attorney stepped forward slightly, his expression composed. It establishes that the original conclusion cannot stand without speculation, and this court does not operate on speculation, he said calmly, his words aligning with the standard the room now understood. Judge Carter nodded once, his gaze returning briefly to the screen before shifting back toward the attorneys. The burden of certainty cannot be met under the current record, he said, his voice quiet but firm. The statement did not echo, it settled deeply into the room. The prosecutor lowered her gaze slightly, not in defeat, but in recognition that the structure she had relied upon no longer supported her position. The defense attorney remained still, allowing the weight of the judge's words to remain undisturbed. Kevin Brooks did not move because he did not need to. The moment had already moved beyond him and into the system itself. The courtroom held its silence, not out of confusion, but out of clarity. Judge Carter leaned back slightly, his posture steady, but transformed. This court cannot proceed under a narrative that has been shown to be incomplete, he continued, his tone unwavering. The clerk recorded each word with precise focus, as if understanding that what was being stated would define everything that followed. The prosecutor did not respond again, her silence now more powerful than any argument she could offer. The defense attorney remained composed, his role fulfilled not through persuasion, but through alignment with what had been revealed. Kevin Brooks stood, as he always had, quiet, observant, and certain. And in that stillness, one truth became clear to everyone present. The case had not simply changed direction, it had been fundamentally redefined. And once a case reaches that point, it no longer belongs to those who tried to control it, it belongs to the truth that reshaped it. The silence that followed was not uncertain, it was resolved. The kind of stillness that comes when every person in the room understands that something final is about to be said. Judge Carter remained composed, his posture steady, his gaze no longer shifting between data and argument, but fixed on the conclusion that had already begun to form. The prosecutor stood still, her earlier position now reduced to acknowledgement rather than opposition. The defense attorney remained calm, his role no longer active, because what needed to be established had already been made clear. Kevin Brooks stood exactly where he had been from the beginning, his presence quiet, but now undeniable, not because he had asserted himself, but because the truth had moved through him and into the room without resistance. Judge Carter finally spoke, his voice measured, deliberate, and clear. The court finds that the evidence presented does not support the claim of exclusive presence within the restricted area, he said, the words steady and controlled. The courtroom did not react outwardly, but the weight of the statement settled across every person present. The prosecutor lowered her gaze slightly, not in defeat, but in recognition that the foundation of the case had been removed, the defense attorney allowed a brief pause before speaking, his tone respectful but firm. Your Honor, in light of these findings, the defense moves for dismissal based on insufficient certainty, he said. His words aligned with what had already been established. Judge Carter nodded once, his gaze returning briefly to the record before him. The motion is granted, he said, his voice calm but carrying finality. The clerk recorded the ruling without hesitation, each keystroke precise, marking the conclusion of what had once appeared certain. The courtroom remained silent, not out of shock, but out of understanding that the outcome had not been forced, it had been revealed. The prosecutor did not object, her silence now an acceptance of the correction that had taken place. The defense attorney stepped back, his posture composed, his role complete without the need for emphasis. Kevin Brooks did not move immediately. He stood for a brief moment longer, his breathing steady, his gaze forward, not seeking recognition, not expecting acknowledgement. Because what had happened was never about being seen, it was about what had been seen clearly. Judge Carter leaned back slightly, his posture unchanged, but his presence different now, no longer defined by unquestioned authority, but by the responsibility to correct when necessary. And as the ruling settled into the record, one truth became clear within the quiet that followed. The system had not failed. Because someone challenged it, it had corrected itself. Because someone refused to ignore what did not align. Kevin finally turned, his movement unhurried, as he stepped away from the place where he had been dismissed just moments before. And in that simple action, there was no triumph, no display, only quiet resolution. Because the moment had never belonged to him alone, it belonged to the truth that had passed through the room and changed everything. Without raising its voice, the courtroom did not return to what it had been before, because once truth reshapes a moment, it leaves something behind that cannot be undone. The air felt different, quieter, but not empty, as if every person present carried a clearer understanding of how easily certainty can be misplaced when it is not examined. Judge Carter remained seated for a moment longer after the ruling, his hands resting lightly against the bench, his expression composed but reflective, not outwardly changed, yet undeniably aware of the shift that had occurred under his authority. The prosecutor gathered her files slowly, her movements precise but subdued, her earlier confidence replaced by a quiet acceptance that the case she had presented had not failed because it was challenged, but because it had been incomplete. The defense attorney closed his folder without urgency, his posture steady, his role fulfilled not through argument, but through alignment with what had been revealed. Kevin Brooks moved toward the exit without drawing attention to himself, his steps measured, his presence returning to the quiet anonymity he had carried into the room. No one called his name, no one stopped him, because the moment did not require acknowledgement, it required understanding. As he reached the door, he paused briefly, not to look back, but to take in the stillness that now filled the space where his voice had once been dismissed. The hallway outside was unchanged, the same muted lighting, the same echo of distant footsteps, the same narrow passage where hours earlier he had noticed something small that did not align. And that was all. It had been a detail overlooked by everyone except the one person who had learned to see what others ignored. Inside the courtroom, Judge Carter finally stood, his posture steady, his presence once again commanding, but now grounded in something deeper than authority. He looked across the room, not at any one person, but at the space itself, as if acknowledging the weight of what had passed through it. The clerk continued her work, recording the final details of the session, her focus precise, her movements unchanged, yet aware that what had been entered into the record carried more than just a decision, it carried a correction. The prosecutor exited without speaking, her silence